On August 11, 2032, a Taiwanese P-3C Orion maritime patrol aircraft thundered low over the crowded waters of the Luzon Strait, 23 miles southeast off the coast of Taiwan. The 13 crew members aboard, normally trading jibes and idle chatter on the long, routine and tedious flights over the featureless water, were today tense and silent. Their flight was in no way routine, as the past 36 hours had been marked by a series of extraordinary events. They began on the Taiwanese island of Kinmen, just 10 kilometers off the coast of mainland China, with the sudden and violent seizure of the lightly garrisoned island by a group calling themselves the Kinmen Liberation Party. Wholly unconvinced, the Taiwanese press was calling them China's Little Green Men, a reference to Russian troops who wore unmarked uniforms during their seizure of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. Within hours of the initial attack, anti-China protests erupted in downtown Taipei, their anger further fueled by video out of Kinmen, showing graphic violence carried out by the so-called Liberation Party against local civilians. Escalating tensions further, counter-protesters arrived in Taipei and, at the Presidential Hall Plaza, news and social media captured video of riot police breaking up the fray. Footage of Chinese nationals, tear-gassed and bloodied, immediately blitzed across China. Soon after, Beijing announced an immediate and total quarantine of Taiwan, requiring any ship or aircraft to notify Chinese authorities before passage through the imposed Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. To enforce the quarantine, the Chinese Coast Guard was deployed to patrol, interdict, and if necessary, stop and search ships, while aircraft patrolled the skies, ready to divert aircraft to mainland China for inspection. Though China stopped short of calling the operation a blockade, a term internationally ruled as an act of war, the quarantine and the thinly veiled assault on Kinmen was nonetheless deemed by Taiwan and much of the international community as a clear and naked attempt by China to strangle, destabilize, and force Taiwan to capitulate to reunification. For its part, the response from Taipei was blunt, stating that the Republic of China would, in no way, stand idle against the illegal Chinese aggression. The question was, how far and for how long were both sides willing to go? As those in Taipei and beyond postulated and planned as to what next, the Taiwanese military was given the difficult task of being responsive and prominent while not provoking, or being provoked, into a kinetic fight. Over the Luzon Strait, the aging Orion and its young crew were attempting just that, to see and be seen, while locating and identifying the multitude of Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia ships operating off the Taiwanese coast, including some, larger than a US destroyer, that were considered Coast Guard, in all but name only. As the crew made their low-altitude patrol, their radio was awash in military air traffic control advisories and warnings, as high above, Chinese and Taiwanese aircraft crisscrossed the skies in a dangerous game of brinkmanship. For Taiwanese pilots and crew, the feeling was that it was only a matter of time before there was an accident or an attack. They would soon find out. Aboard the Orion, the crew received an urgent ATC alert. An unidentified Chinese aircraft had begun a sudden and rapid descent toward their position. As the Orion crew quickly changed course, so did the descending aircraft, setting the two for a suspected headbutt, a maneuver where an aircraft aggressively cuts in front of another, an event now carried out with such frequency by China that it had almost become routine. With cameras rolling, the Orion crew awaited the sudden flash of a fighter jet off their nose. Instead, the Chinese aircraft, a high-speed, unarmed drone, slammed into the Orion in a suicidal dive. Several nearby aircraft and ships witnessed the fireball and heard the brief, garbled maydays as the crippled Orion spun into the sea, killing all 13 aboard. They, and those on the island of Kinmen, would be the first casualties as the Third World War spread to the Pacific. At Camp H.M. Smith on Oahu, Hawaii, home to the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, Indo-PACOM Commander, U.S. Navy Admiral Michael Mulliken, joined a hastily arranged video conference with the U.S. National Security Council following the news of China's action in Kinmen and its quarantine of Taiwan. From the Joint Chiefs to CIA, the State, DOD to the White House, the mood was dark in Washington. With the US already fully committed to a war in the Baltics with Russia, news in Taiwan was what some in the meeting called the nightmare scenario. Leading the briefing, Admiral Mulliken laid out what was known, that there were currently over 180 Chinese Coast Guard ships, along with hundreds of maritime militia and fishing vessels, operating in the region and within 24 nautical miles of the Taiwanese coast, while over 200 aircraft, including fighter, combat, ISR, EW, and UAVs, were now flying in or near Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Farther out, 5 surface action groups of the People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN, including one Fujian-class aircraft carrier, were patrolling in the region, with 2 more surface action groups and carriers preparing to leave port within hours or days. The massive Chinese deployment had not come as a surprise, as the build-up and mobilization had been monitored for months, the scale of it causing deep alarm in Washington. What remained elusive was the PRC's ultimate intent. Desensitized by China's countless sudden and large-scale exercises over the past 2 decades, it had grown nearly impossible for US and Allied intelligence to judge what might be a move toward war, and what was not. In response to the build-up, Admiral Mulliken had asked for contingency forces to be placed on alert. The request quickly approved and deployment orders issued, all in the hopes that the Chinese would see it as a response and deterrent, and not an escalation. That deterrent had failed. Now the US was facing 2 intertwining crises in Taiwan, the quarantine, and what had come as a bolt out of the blue, the seizure of Kinmen. Kinmen was the most immediate issue. With several hundred US and Allied citizens on the island, as well as a small number of US Army Green Berets stationed and acting as trainers and advisors, their safe and swift extraction was paramount. As of yet, there were no US casualties reported on the island, while the Kinmen Liberation Party, a group that US intelligence quickly assessed to be a combination of PLA and private Chinese military, released a statement that the Kinmen airport would remain open to allow foreigners to safely depart the island over the next 48 hours. The news provided thin relief at Indo-PACOM that the evacuation would not take place while under fire. Admiral Mulliken anticipated that with civilian and military transport aircraft already in the air, the evacuation of US and Allied citizens and military staff would likely be completed in the next 18 hours. The question for the room now was what next? Was Kinmen and the quarantine the prelude to an invasion of the main island of Taiwan? Or was Kinmen the short-term prize and, after a period of time, China would call off the quarantine? The statements from Beijing only muddied the waters, calling the quarantine a law enforcement action, meant to protect Chinese citizens on the island by halting the import of Western weaponry and support. The PRC entirely avoided any statement about Kinmen, but further blamed Taiwan for its export of advanced semiconductors that, quote, furthered the war effort in Europe and the needless deaths of innocent civilians. The Council was unanimous that Beijing's public statement was, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Paul Pavluk, eloquently put it, utter and total bullshit. As for Taiwan, its president, Ying Yao-chen, was threading a dangerous needle, vehemently rejecting the quarantine and seizure of Kinmen, calling for UN intervention and presenting a show of force, while desperately trying to avoid being drawn into battle. That led to the Council's next question, that if it came to it, would Taiwan fight or fold? Secretary of Defense Bruce Lager put it more bluntly, if we fully commit and things go hot, and then Taiwan packs up the moment it gets rough, well, we're f***ed. We'll have stepped into a war for nothing. The room was initially divided on the issue, the split only broken after an assessment provided by a little-known but influential intelligence department within the State Department, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, or INR. With a reputation for getting it right, from its prediction that Ukraine would withstand Russia's initial invasion to as far back as its analysis that the war in Vietnam would be a US failure, the INR confidently assessed that, though Taiwan's civilian populace appeared at times disinterested and seemingly in denial of the threat, they would fully rally to total war once the threat was existential. It was enough to convince the Council. Yet there remained hope that war was not inevitable. But there was also a harsh reality that short of war, the US had few current options to end the crisis quickly. Retaking Kinmen, for example, was completely off the table, whether supporting Taiwan directly or indirectly. "We've wargamed it," said Lager. "We'd lose a carrier, possibly two." That left only one favorable military option agreed upon in the Council, that Indo-PACOM would present a sizable show of force in the region as a statement of commitment to Taiwan and deterrence against further action by China. To that end, air, naval and marine forces based in the western US that were already on surge status after events in Europe would remain so, but increase in scale, and remain ready to deploy immediately if needed. Air units currently operating in the theater would remain in place, their scheduled rotations out, delayed. Carrier Strike Group 5 and its flagship, the USS George Washington, operating east of Taiwan, would remain on station, acting as the tip of the spear. And Carrier Strike Group 9 with the USS Theodore Roosevelt, having just left Hawaii for a return to San Diego, would instead be ordered to turn back and position west of Hawaii. In a press release, the reason would be blamed on an unspecified mechanical issue. The thinly veiled lie and the message to China was clear. The US would not provoke China into a fight, but the US also wasn't backing down, and it wasn't going away. "And if Premier Howe doesn't back down," asked Secretary of State John Schneider. "Then we may have to see if the tiger has teeth," said President Dalman. "Is Taiwan worth it?" "Make no mistake," said Director of National Intelligence Stuart Potter. "This is more than just about Taiwan. This is about autocracy versus rule of law. This is about who controls the next century." President Dalman agreed. As the Council turned to the discussion of diplomatic options, including lobbying for economic sanctions against China in a forthcoming emergency UN Security Council meeting, the room received new and disturbing updates. First came word of the downing of the Taiwanese patrol aircraft. Beijing immediately blamed Taiwan, stating that the P-3C Orion crew had acted aggressively, putting themselves in harm's way. Radar tracking video from Taiwan quickly disputed it, but on social media that fact was buried in a sea of disinformation. Then, minutes later, the Council would receive a new and more distressing update. Taiwan had just gone offline. Coming up in the next episode, Beijing puts the quarantine to the test as it plots the next, and more dangerous, path ahead. If you enjoy this series, please send a YouTube thanks or join the Flat Circle History Patreon site, where you will get behind-the-scenes access, member-only content, or even have a character named after you. Plus, it will help out John, the guy who makes this all possible. Also, a quick few shout-outs. First, for the help provided by my channel's very own tamed surface warfare officer. I've been told that on his office wall he has a picture of the inside of his office wall, and that he would have joined Space Force, but he was too tall to be a door gunner on Starliner. I don't think that's true. All I know is that he's called Darth Rust, and I thank him for his support and assistance. Also, shout out to Tsuchi Shu for your insight and time in addressing the complexities coming in this Season 2. And a major thank you to the creator of the YouTube channel FIXEDIT, acting as theatrical advisor and filming many of the amazing shots in this, and hopefully future, episodes. And finally, a special shout out to Michael Hilliard, creator and host of the geopolitical podcast, The Red Line, who graciously gave his time to review and advise on my outline for Season 2. If you haven't checked out The Red Line, you should. Thanks to you all. And, as always, please like, subscribe, and share this video. And thanks for watching.